Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, we are going to be basically doing some critical thinking through these concepts of introversion and extroversion. And what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to walk us through these critical thinking steps to evaluate, is introversion and extroversion even real? What does it really mean? Because my personal philosophy on this is you're probably not an introvert, you're probably antisocial. And there's a big difference between the two. I think the way that we conceptualize introversion and extroversion creates some problems for us as a society, and especially for those of us that are healing from trauma. So we're going to walk through kind of the current zeitgeist pop psychology commentary as to what exactly an introvert and an extrovert is. Then we're going to just briefly look at what that really means on a biological level. And then we're going to zoom out for a second, and we're going to look at the species as a whole and what makes sense for us. And then we're going to consider conditioning. And when we look at all of these things together, we're going to, I think, by the end, I ought to be able to convince you that there's a good chance that the people that you think of as extroverted maybe aren't extroverted, and the people that you think of as introverted, including yourself possibly, are not introverted. Now, these terms that we think of as introverted and extroverted have a lot more to do with pro-social or antisocial behaviors more than it does what is termed a social homeostasis. So, to start us off, what is an introvert? What is an extrovert? When most of us think about what an introvert is, we think about the quiet person, the shy person who's sitting on the edge of the party or doesn't go at all and would prefer to stay home. We think of the homebody, that quiet, shy person who keeps to themselves and doesn't really enjoy social engagement. And when we think of the extrovert, we think of the life of the party. We think of somebody who's loud. We think of somebody who's full of life and needs to be around other people. They have to be around other people in order for them to feel good or to feel whole or happy or healthy. And I think that that's wrong. The cliches that we have for what is an introvert and extrovert are really basic, and that's what cliches are. They're stereotypes, right? So we're trying to kind of synthesize a collection of behaviors and label it something so it's easy to talk about. And when we do that with introversion and extroversion, I think what we're mixing up is social behaviors versus a social homeostasis. And when we think about social behaviors, we have to consider conditioning. And the social homeostasis, we also need to consider conditioning, but it's more of a downstream, indirect association or correlation rather than a direct one. Basically, it just takes a little longer for our social homeostasis stuff to switch, because when we're talking about social homeostasis and we're getting into the nuts and bolts, we're really talking about dopamine release, and the homeostasis part really being about the number of dopamine receptors that are in the brain. So social homeostasis is this concept that makes sense because we as a species grew up with nature in large groups. We come from monkeys, right? So throughout time, from the time that we were monkeys till now, we've depended upon each other for our safety, for our food, for working together to have villages, to collect food, to hunt, to do everything, to build cities and roads and bridges and barns. We've always depended upon each other. And this is the first and most fundamental point of why I don't believe introversion, the way that we view it, like kind of societally, even really exists. I do believe that there are introverts and extroverts, and I believe that the difference between them is quite small. But social homeostasis is this concept that every human being, because we're a social species, has to have some level of social engagement in order to maintain homeostasis, right? Homeostasis being like, I'm good all on my own, in the most generic terms. And that homeostasis comes from having co-evolved with nature and working together through our co-evolution, and that's how we found security and advancement as a species. But that homeostasis can change over time, and it changes through conditioning. And what actually changes when you look at this over time is, like I said before, the dopamine dump from dopamine neurons, from dopaminergic neurons, and the number of receptors for said dopamine near those neurons. And specifically, that dopamine in the social bonding circuits of the brain, because there is actually just one basic social bonding circuit that encompasses all of the bonding that a human being can do, which is a little weird, but makes sense. The body is super conservative that way and super efficient with its uses. So why have more than one circuit if it's so fundamental? But we only have one circuit to cover the bonding that happens between like mother and infant, or sex partners, or friendships. But within the center of that circuit, we're looking at the dopamine release versus the dopamine release from dopaminergic neurons for introverted and extroverted people. And really what's happening inside somebody who is actually introverted is that they're producing more dopamine than their extroverted counterparts given from a given social interaction. That sounds kind of backwards, but it's not. Introverts produce more dopamine per social interaction, which gives them that sense of satisfaction. And these we know has been validated through neuroimaging. But what I find interesting here is that they're talking about dopamine in most of these, and Andrew Huberman, Dr. Huberman in the Huberman Lab podcast also covered a bit of this from a different angle, just kind of purely from the nuts and bolts biological or neurobiological angle. And that was a really cool podcast. But what happens, and even he focused on dopamine, and he said, but there's a bunch of dopamine that gets dumped in the introverts, which makes sense because they get more satisfaction. They get more satisfaction from a given social interaction, and that's why they need less, right? Whereas the extroverted person will produce less dopamine per social interaction, and therefore need more social interactions in order to reach social homeostasis. So I know it sounds a little weird, but it's backwards, but it does make sense. The thing that I want them to do more studies on that I didn't find enough information of was serotonin, because serotonin is this satisfaction. Serotonin is associated with this satisfaction, and oxytocin with bonding. And so just looking at the dopamine there doesn't really make sense, although they were looking at bonding specifically, and dopamine is a necessary part of bonding along with oxytocin. But I would like to see more studies where they're looking at serotonin levels that are created or dumped by serotonergic neurons in those same parts of the brain, because I think that would be a more accurate yardstick for whether a person is actually introverted and extroverted. Now, both of them together are probably a better yardstick than either separately, but I digress. Now we've covered, we know the cliches, right? We've covered the cliches of the introversion and like the introvert and the extrovert. And it's basically the introvert is quiet and shy, and the extrovert is loud and not shy and very much a people person. But there's something really important to understand here, that extroverts are not always loud. Not every person that you see talking at a social engagement is an extrovert. They might be an introvert who's really good at communication, or somebody who talks for a living. And so they're good at that. They're good at socializing and talking and running around. Myself included, I'm one of these people that will be incredibly social in a social engagement, in a social interaction. I can run around and talk to folks, and I can be super social. I can be a little social butterfly. My favorite is to get into a one-on-one conversation with somebody that goes really deep. That's my next favorite. Well, that's actually my favorite. The next favorite's floating around until I find somebody to do that with. But after that social engagement, I am done. My ability to talk, my desire to talk or to be around people is gone. It is utterly kaput. I'm exhausted after talking to so many people for so long. And that's part of why I think we're really getting this whole introvert and extrovert thing wrong. Just because a person is talkative or loud does not mean that they're an extrovert. They could be a painfully shy person who has gone through some trauma that makes them want and need to reach out to find some kind of bond with somebody else. And that seeking for that bond, if their trauma is strong enough, that seeking for that bond can overwhelm absolutely every other part of their biology and personality and cause them to run out. And although they actually don't want to be around people, they're doing what I call the smash and grab, where somebody tells a story and you smash and grab everybody's attention. You smash by telling some trauma story that nobody was ready for, that maybe wasn't appropriate for the time, but it made sense to you, and you slammed it out into the middle of the conversation so you can grab some attention. Right. And that's a very talkative person. And we all know that person. They're usually young, right? In their late teens and early 20s and whatnot. And I've been that person. But that does not mean that that person is extroverted. It just means that that person was talkative that day. So it's, I think, important to understand that extroversion does not mean talkative in the same way that quiet does not mean introverted. You can have a very extroverted person who was made to feel some type of way about the way that they communicate, or maybe they had a speech impediment at some point, or any number of things that can affect our conditioning over time. But a person who is extroverted, really what that actually means biologically in reference to the social homeostasis is that they just need a little bit more social engagement in order to fill their social batteries. Right? Like, we all have these social batteries that help us to feel safe and secure, because that's what biologically kept us safe and secure for millennia. And if we start to feel off, we can just re-up that and we feel better. We fill our social batteries. Introverts fill them with less engagement, and extroverts fill them with slightly more engagement. But this concept that an introvert is quiet or an extrovert is loud is absolutely wrong. We know this just by talking to introverts and extroverts, especially anybody over the age of 35 or 40. Because you start to really recognize that a lot of our behaviors and patterns of behavior come from compulsively seeking to change the ending of a traumatic event from our past. So an introverted person isn't necessarily quiet. You can have a person who walks up to you, and you have one conversation, and they had a great time in that one conversation in the grocery line, and they went home, and that was enough for them for a week. But they talked and talked and talked, and you guys had a great time, and it was done. But because they only needed one interaction over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 days, whatever, that is what would make them an introvert rather than an extrovert. But they were talkative. So this concept of loud and extroversion is not correlative. This concept of introversion and quietness is not correlative. There is some parallels, but it's not actually a correlation. Some associations, sure, not a correlation. And I think that's really, really important, because most of the way that we act and behave, like I said, especially for those of us with much trauma in our past, up until the age of 30 is mostly just compulsively reliving those experiences and trying to change the ending. Hopefully we're aware of that and we can do that consciously. If not, we just keep playing out the same behaviors over and over and over and over again, and nothing ever changes. And that's where you get the kind of cliches of the loud person. But really, I think what we consider to be an extrovert is not actually an extrovert. I think it's somebody who is pro-social. And most importantly, I think that people who consider themselves to be introverts are not actually introverts. You're antisocial. And this is really fundamentally important for growth and healing, because if you checked out the last episode, if you checked out the episode on polyvagal theory, then you understand that we have 3 branches of the vagus nerve. We have the socialization ventral branch, we have this middle branch that's sympathetic, and we have this dorsal vagal branch that's parasympathetic. And that social branch is what gives us a dimmer switch on the other 2. Otherwise, it's just on and off, because we grew up talking about fight and flight and rest and digest, but that's not actually the correlation either. It's fight and flight and freeze and fawn are the correlation. Play and sex are the opposite of rest and digest. Those are the actual correlations. And without proper bonding and social engagement, social bonding, this social homeostasis that can only happen through engagement of that ventral vagus, this social bonding thing that is exclusive to mammals in our biology. Without proper engagement of that channel, then we are guaranteed to be either stuck in sympathetic or parasympathetic. And I don't mean fight and flight or rest and digest. I mean fight and flight or freeze and fawn. Total immobilization. You're either mobilizing to deal with a threat directly, or you're immobilizing to deal with the threat through fawning and freezing. But your body shuts down. That's where we get the Crohn's and the IBS and all that sort of thing. Without the proper socialization of that ventral vagus, we don't have a dimmer switch. The dimmer switch allows us to access the blended states, and the blended states of parasympathetic and sympathetic are rest and digest for the dorsal vagal and the sympathetic vagus, whereas the sympathetic vagus and the ventral vagus are still sympathetic and parasympathetic, but those together are fun, play, and sex. Those are the blended states, and we want to be able to play and have sex, and we want to be able to rest and digest. And in order to do either of those, we have to engage this front social engagement circuit. So the reason I say that I don't think introverts exist is because the way that we talk about introverts. We've already covered it's not about quiet and loud. So when I say introverts don't exist, what I mean is most of the people who consider themselves introverts, I don't believe are introverts. They're antisocial. And the reason is totally understandable. It's through conditioning, right? If we have a rough start, a rough childhood, and everybody does to some degree or another, we learn not to rely on other people. We couldn't rely on our caregivers as infants, and that is the root of our antisocial behaviors, because the body, through polyvagal theory, we learned always moves through that hierarchy in the exact same order. First social, then sympathetic, then dorsal. So first ventral, then sympathetic, the middle, and then dorsal, every single time. That is the hierarchy that our biology is programmed to move us through whenever we detect a threat. Whenever we are in stress, we're in stress because we detect a threat. And when that happens, the first response that our body has is to socially engage, to move closer to our friends, to move closer to the family, to move closer to the other monkeys. If there is a lion off in the distance, you can just kind of scoot your way back to the center of the group, and there's safety in numbers, right? And the threat at that point isn't too terribly awful high, hopefully. But that's always the first step. And then after that, you're like, oh, well, now it's closer. We move into fight or flight. And if we feel that that is not a strategy that can work for one reason or another, and our body will decide for us to move us into an immobilization strategy, and we move into freeze or fawn. We do not move into rest or digest. So over time, because we don't have proper bonding with our caregivers, we're not securely attached. If you don't know attachment theory, there's this secure attached, insecure attachment. I'm not going to go into all of that now, but if you're not securely attached, what that means is that first attempt to find safety through socialization, through that ventral vagus, failed from the time that you were a baby. It proved itself not typically reliable, because mom worked swing shifts, or was a single mom, or because she was depressed, or because you were a foster kid, or because of any number of reasons you weren't able to bond well with your caregiver. Over time, your biology stopped trying to bond to find safety. And this is another fundamental principle of polyvagal theory. If that is the case, and trying to find safety through bonding doesn't work, then we will find safety through survival mechanisms each time. That means turning off that social engagement and only being in fight and flight, or freeze and fawn, not rest and digest. You're only in a mobilized state to deal with stress, or you are in a immobilized state to deal with stress. And this is where we get our anxiety and our depression. This is where we get bipolar disorder, going from one to the other, because we spend so long immobilized in a depressive states that we try to counterbalance that by doing stuff and being better and being good and happy when we're in our positive states. And that's the swings from depression to mania, if you want to use those words. So what I think has happened in most people who consider themselves introverts, many of them, not all, but many, may not actually have been introverts to begin with. They may have become introverted over time because they learned through experience and conditioning that social engagement is not a reliable way to find safety. So they just stopped trying to be around people. And that's totally understandable. Unfortunately, here's where the rubber meets the road. Without social engagement, without the engagement of that ventral vagus mechanism, there is no way to get into sex and play or rest and digest. We're stuck forever in either everything is fine, or we have a thought and then suddenly we're tossed either into a state of immobilization or a state of hypermobilization, which means we can never get out of it. If we choose to consider ourselves introverted when we're actually antisocial, that is a recipe for disaster for everyone across the board, period, the end. Because if you think you being antisocial is the same as being introverted, then you'll be like, well, I'm just introverted. That's fine. I don't have to change that. And no, you don't. However much social engagement you need in order to fill your social batteries to reach this social homeostasis, that's great. That's fine. That's you. Do you, boo-boo. I don't care what it is. I don't care how much or how long or how many engagements it takes or how sparse they are. I really don't. But that's not what's happening. The people who consider themselves to be introverted are usually introverted because they're antisocial. And then if you don't engage that social, you're going to be stuck in anxiety or depression for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life. Do you hear that? And I'm not trying to be, I don't know. I'm not trying to be anything other than really fucking honest right now. And to point out, I'm a really big fan of understanding what is happening in my biology that underpins my behavior. And I've become this way because of my own trauma. But it's been a very powerful tool because it's helped me to go, oh, I behave this way because these are my options biologically. Understanding the anatomy, the neuroanatomy, the whatever part of the anatomy that's appropriate for the thing I'm looking at. Polyvagal shows us that it is undeniable that without proper socialization and social bonding and the ability to find safety through socialization, even if it's just with one person, a partner or whatever, you have to be able to engage with that. And one person is not enough, which is why people who are traumatized and date other traumatized people fuck everything up, because we're finally safe with one person and then we want to share everything with that one person. But then all of our crap is dumped on one person. And that's not fair. It's not going to work out well because they're also traumatized and they're also trying to bond, but everybody's sharing their trauma all of the time. We wind up, things are good for a little while, but then we'll wind up again either hyper or hypo mobilized. We've got to get this concept out into the zeitgeist for people to be talking about, because there's nothing wrong with being introverted or extroverted. I've got some good friends that are quite introverted. I think I'm kind of right in the middle. I might be a teensy bit more extroverted than introverted, but I don't think it's actually extroverted because I don't need that much social engagement to feel okay, but I need quality social engagement because in order for me to feel okay, I have to regularly touch base with the fundamental principles of the universe and why things are the way they are and that sort of thing, because for me, being privy to the depths of life makes the pains of life worth living. So I do need a good chunk of social interaction, but I think that social interaction that I need is more predicated on that part of me more than it is my social homeostasis, because I could get that, and do get that by studying, by watching YouTube videos or listening to podcasts. I can get that without it really being that social. And I can have that feeling satiated within me. But I think we have to be really careful when it comes to introversion specifically, because we have to be able to understand that we don't have a choice. Our biology functions the way that it functions because there are millions of years of evidence alive in our DNA, millions of years of information and memory that has kept our entire species alive for millions of years. And the overwhelming majority of it is based on being social. Like I said, that's how we built this world. We come from monkeys that live in social groups as well. So to think that a person can live their life without being social, or that they can be antisocial and call it introversion and sweep it all under the rug and then suffer with mental health. Ouch, man. So if you know somebody who is an introvert, who considers themselves to be an introvert, but you also notice that they're not just introverted or they're a bit antisocial, they don't like being around people, chances are they've got a long list of good ass reasons that they don't trust anybody. But without learning to trust at least a couple of folks, they are guaranteed to spend the rest of their lives back and forth, flipping between hypo and hypermobilized for everything that stresses them out. For everything. So if that's you, or if that's a close friend of yours, please think about this. Please, from the bottom of my heart, think about this. Are you introverted or are you antisocial? Because one of them is fine. Both of them are fine in some ways. But when it comes to mental health and living a fulfilling life, being an introvert or being an extrovert really doesn't matter. But being antisocial does. So don't excuse your fear of people because of your bad past with introversion, because they're not the same. They're not the same at all. One is just a part of you. The other is a reaction. It's conditioning to a long list of bad shit that's happened. And you've earned it, and you've earned the right to have some distance from that. But if you continue down that path of antisocial and just being like, well, this is me, you're fucking yourself. And that's biology. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. It's a little bit of a shorter one, but I'm glad, and it feels like this one went pretty well. I feel like I have a tendency to wander sometimes, and this one felt pretty direct, right to the point. So if you enjoyed this podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member or consider buying me a coffee. All of the links are down below. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a marvelous week. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.